Thanks very much, Adrian. Welcome, guys, to the stage. We've got a little bit of a smaller group today, so we've lost a couple in action, I think, already, but that's okay. We've got a really interesting topic today around energy risk in the Australian industry sector. From, I guess, an Electronet perspective, we have a lot of large industrial connected parties where obviously large generators are connected. It's a very topical part of our business on a daily basis, and also my interactions with our direct customers from an industry perspective and the risk they perceive. So risk also from our perspective in conversations, very much the individual, the party's perspective as well. A risk to someone might not be a risk to someone else, and how you handle that and how you value it. So hopefully we can get something today for the group here, that some take-homes, what can we consider, how do we go about it? And I think another key element associated with this is about knowledge. So from my old project management days, if you've got a lot of knowledge, you can help you evaluate risks much better than if you don't have it. So I'll really allow you to sort of introduce yourselves as work way around, but really keen just as a starting point to look at how energy pricing, security and overall energy risk is affecting the industrial sectors in Australia from your perspective, your experiences and your current role.
Yeah, happy to take it to start with. My name's Tony Dixon. I'm Chief Executive of the Australian Steel Institute. We represent the whole Australian supply chain, so from the big steel manufacturers through to processors, fabricators and a lot of manufacturers. So we have a broad cross-section of people. I think to frame this from our perspective, this is becoming a critical issue. A couple of years ago, we were starting to get a lot of noise from our members, and we're starting to signal that there's a certain, we were quite firm that there was a catastrophe brewing. We've seen that come to pass. What's happened to our sector is since about 2015, we've seen overlaid across the economy about $30.5 billion of costs in the gas sector and about 30.7 in the electricity sector. This is really important because the industrial sector, the manufacturing sector, is a trade-exposed industry, either competing with imports or exporting in the world market, and so it's a fundamental cost input into our businesses. It goes to a competitiveness issue for Australia. Fiscal, monetary and exchange rate are pretty important macro factors, but every business has energy. My members are varied in their energy usage, but it's anywhere from 30–40% and north. So we really think this is a critical issue. The previous panel highlighted there's differences between the East Coast and the West Coast, but certainly the breakdown and discussions and the market failings on the East Coast, driven by political instability or political arguing, is a critical issue for our members.
Yeah, thanks, Ash. I'm Andrew Richards. I'm the CEO of Jimi Hendrix Foundation. Energy Users Association. Our members are very broad-based, so everything from large retail, commercial, industrial, right through to mining and aluminium and heavy industry. I think it's fair to say that energy users have basically been going through the 5 stages of grief in the last 3 or 4 years through these price shocks, and some are still fairly angry about it, and some are even still trying to, I guess, resist the fact that there's a transition underway, where at the other end others have actually recognised that there's a new normal that's now in place and they need to do different things to manage that. So we're actually starting to see a fair bit of innovation occurring as well at consumer land, understanding what new normal is. And this is a big conversation we're having with our members, and I know you are as well, around, and it's electricity and gas as well, Ash. So it's, if you're thinking that the new normal is still $40 wholesale and $4 gas, then you're in a fantasy world and your business will probably fail. You need to be thinking about what a new normal of electricity is, around $60 to $70 a megawatt hour, and gas, quite frankly, if we can get it at $8 a gigajoule, we're probably holding a party. So that's the new context we need to be understanding. We also need to be understanding that there is a transition going on in the sector, and that will require additional investment in things like transmission and other things that have traditionally always been done by state governments, but they're now having to be done by private enterprise. And there's a whole different set of financial imperatives and outcomes there as well. So we need to understand that ownership has changed, we need to understand that technology is changing, and we need to understand that consumers need to change with it, because if they don't, then they will fail.
Yeah, Ash. Is that on? Yeah. I suppose we're coming at it from a slightly different angle, Ash. So I'm representing the Clean Energy Council, which is almost like the peak body for the renewable energy industry in the country. So we just get involved in hopefully sensible conversation around policy and putting some governance into the emerging renewable energy industry. So be that from installers through to technologies, put some governance around that. And we've probably got about 300 members that vary from developers to technology providers to retailers. So we've kind of a diverse type of role we play in the industry. So I guess we'll complement the viewpoints of the guys here. So not to kind of replicate too much what the last panel were saying, but I think the point we're saying, what we're seeing is the innovation piece, driving C&I companies to really start looking at the innovation piece, and that's kind of where we're coming in. So we're seeing, massive interest coming from the sector for our members, and that's just leading to a huge amount of opportunities and ultimately investment, be it overseas or Australian investment. So it's kind of the angle we're taking at this conversation. Ash.
Chris?
Yes, good morning. My name is Chris Davis. I'm a director of the Australasian Institute of Mining and Metallurgy, which represents all the geologists, mining engineers and metallurgists. Until recently, all those people have developed mining projects with a complete disdain for the energy that they use. They're more interested in, is there rock with value? How do I extract it and how do I process it? But more recently, we're seeing people trying to understand not how to get, some people are looking how to get energy smarter, but other people are looking at don't raise the bridge, lower the river. As we sit here today, there is another conference on down at Murdoch, which is about lithium. And one of the issues down there is the separation of the waste from the ore. And there's a particularly deep mine in West Australia who have an enormous haul up ramp with diesel trucks. And they're looking at taking a sorting machine underground to get rid of half the ore, which is the waste that's mixed with the ore. So you can do smarter things. You don't have to understand how do I get a cheap 10 meg power station from mill, because that's an oxymoron these days. But if you can reduce that power station from 10 meg to 5 meg, you've done a really good job by separating out the waste early on. And so we're increasingly seeing people do that. For example, there's at Kambalda, there are people processing waste dumps down there, which have 0.25% nickel. They're putting them through an ore sorter and producing 2.5% nickel. So once again, they're looking at how to lower the river, not raise the bridge. That's a really important thing to do. The other part of this is with lithium. 8 months ago, there's a large truck manufacturer whose conundrum was, how can we get more than one haul cycle out of a battery-powered truck? All they had to do was keep on trialing it, because in the 8 months since they had that question, the batteries in question have gone from lasting an hour for that truck to 4 hours. So the battery technology is coming on faster and faster. So while this conference is, a lot of it is towards the non-conventional energy generation, you should also be thinking in terms of batteries which are becoming a quantum more effective. While you're still thinking about what you're thinking about, someone else is moving faster than you are on another part of the equation. So I think we have to include all that in the mix of energy.
I agree. It's an element also of how you go about your business, as well as the actual cost of energy ultimately when I need it as well. I know, Dermot, from the perspective of the Clean Energy Council, a lot of innovation trying to come across from that side. And I think that's one of the key, linking back to your point, point, Andrew, there about the risk element. Yeah, there is so much transition happening with so many things going on. That knowledge element, the group before talked about it, that element about when do I make a decision, how do I value the risks on these, is such a really complex world at the moment. I'm not saying you can't put answers to some of these, but it's a lot to think about versus what we had to think about even only a few years ago. So how your members or groups actually think about what are the questions I ask around risk on energy? Generally it's about I want cheaper prices and I want more reliable. How do I move through that?
Yeah, we're with the discussion around the National Energy Guarantee and all the things that go around that, including the Integrated System Plan and any number of other initiatives that are going on at the moment. And with the rate of technology change, there's to try and create a business case now for some kind of internal action to address that is very difficult. So let's talk about demand response, for example. It's very difficult for a large energy consumer to sit there and build a business case for demand response now because there's no market structure to give them any confidence and there's no forward price curve. And the only way I can respond into the demand response market is if I do it through AEMO's reserve trader or through my retailer, who's going to take a pretty decent clip on the way through, and they're only going to use demand management to manage their own exposure to the wholesale market. So we see things like the demand response mechanisms overseas with day-ahead markets as something that AEMO is looking at, and a critical component of the National Energy Guarantee is to try and develop a demand response market. So we can actually have a structure in place, a guided structure, that gives boards confidence to actually tick off on that business case, and some way of developing a forward price curve so we can understand what the NPV is going to look like. So we do need a structure to the transition that we've had. We've had 10 years of chaos in the transition, and chaos has failed us badly. We need far more structure around that transition, recognising the transition is already underway. And I'll just circle back to a previous point. There is a new normal in play. But within that, we also have to understand that there are some companies with certain facilities who simply can't go on paying $70 or $80 for wholesale or $10 for gas. So is there a transformational policy, industry policy in there that helps those guys out move to a better place? Now, we're supportive of the ETIs, I'm sure Tony's as well. ETIs, which is the exemptions for trade exposed industry. ETIs isn't transformational. It's a band-aid over a cost. So we would like to see industry policy that actually transforms these businesses so that they are more sustainable, so they can actually survive the rough and tumble of what will be a still pretty unusual set of circumstances in the market, including being exposed to international gas prices.
Yeah, I'll just build on that. I support those comments. We are in a transition. It's important to understand we're in a transition. It was really interesting to listen to the previous panel, and a lot of the issues were very similar. We support moving to a cleaner energy environment. The triumvirate came up in the last panel. The principle's really important. What's important is we look at it through a frame of affordable, reliable, low emissions, and we work through the transition. I think we are at a tipping point, that there's new innovations and new opportunities in here. Demand response principles, the principles in the NEG are sound. The devil is going to be in the detail. Support for the ETs is important. It's about how we manage across that journey to the new environment we're coming in. We are coming down the curve very fast, and a lot of the renewables offer some really good options, but there's the intermittency issue that affect our businesses, and we have to factor that in and find a way to manage through that. Okay,
I think Dermot, you might want to comment on that too. I sort of think that tipping point is really interesting, because I know from the perspective of all our large industrial direct connected, I want 24/7, but I'd also love 100% solar. There's a challenge in that, fundamental, that tipping point of how you balance up, security 24/7 with renewables, with new technologies, is a real challenge for us. But I know CEC obviously looking at that.
Yeah, look, you're dead right, Ash. And we completely support. I think we'll go on to more policy conversation in a while, which could keep us here for a while, hopefully keep you guys awake. But from just a consumer perspective, what we're actually seeing is a strong indication coming through from industry is kind of going, okay, we understand that policy has a huge place to play, and governments as well, but aside from that, how can we get them out of the way? How can we actually park them and actually make decisions ourselves, take ownership back? So we see, the fringe of grid and off-grid space looking at their behind-the-meter options, which is, very relevant for a lot of people in the room, but also from a retail space and in gas, electricity, people are going, okay, what are my options? You know, where does the IPP space fit into this? Where's the change from the norm happening? And I think we've passed that tipping point, Ash, that industry just kind of said, okay, this has changed. Now, how do we actually just move on and maximise it for our businesses?
Chris, if you've got anything to...
Yes, I suppose my point of view is around the mines which are, with very few exceptions, remote powered, although you've got some with gas pipes going to them. And the issue, there's a real issue, and that it's that intermittency that when I take that 10 meg mine site, which has to be able to operate constantly at 10 meg because it's got a dirty, great big grinding mill, and it's got to operate all night. And I know that there are some places where wind blows best at night, but you've got to have this 10 meg continually. So you're fighting the solar wind is really fighting the price of diesel. So you've got the price of diesel as an operating cost versus the capital of the intermittency, because otherwise you've got to have a battery the same size as that one that Tesla put in to South Australia. And when you look at the efficiency of solar, you're coming up with an enormous capital installation to get rid of that intermittency. And that, from the mine's point of view, is a real problem, because there are so few of the mines. I put the extension to the Swiss in '87 to Golden Grove, which was another 130 odd Ks, but they're never going to feed back because the Swiss extensions, like the one to Kalgoorlie, was put in as one way, so the power lines get smaller, so even Kalgoorlie can't backfeed because the line's too small to backfeed. So we are damned by the decisions made some years ago. And that intermittency, or trying to generate power in other places, is a real issue for the mines.
You're right, there's a real challenge there. I mean, the grid, and we see it from grid connected versus remote in South Australia even, that you know, the grid connected parties, they get the opportunity that the grid actually sort of self-supports itself. It's connected across the whole NEM on the East Coast, even with the Swiss over here. You get a bit of buffering from that. But yeah, remote side's got a very different business case to try and drive at the moment, and that's hopefully where innovation goes. I guess the key next question for the group here is, what's your latest views or latest thoughts on and updates on policy around this? One is obviously about bringing on technologies to be able to make it more competitive and business cases better. But the other point, like, you know, and I see it very much with a lot of our direct clients, is that longer term strategic policy to be able to make longer term decisions and surety. We even have it from our perspective to be able to provide a solution. We want to see that those businesses have got surety about what they're doing to be able to support them as well.
Yeah, so the National Energy Guarantee is probably the key thing at the moment. So there are some who don't like it because there's no explicit support for renewables. There's others who don't like it because there's no explicit support for coal. And we kind of think that's a win, because at the end of the day, the consumer-funded free lunch of energy supply needs to end. We need to assist those companies to transition, but at the end of the day, renewables is cheap and still going down its cost curve. We need the firming capacity to come down its cost curve, and it's more likely to do it than, say, fossil fuels that is maybe heading in the other direction. So at the end of the day, have a level playing field for everyone. Don't have overt consumer subsidies for one thing or the other. Let the market play it out. And then also, if you're really interested in consumer costs, then you need to be helping consumers adapt to this. And that may also include the new infrastructure required to get into the best resource zones for renewables. Maybe you should be thinking about, if there's a subsidy somewhere or a government intervention somewhere, maybe it's in that, to make that as efficient as it possibly can be. Now, that could be done through the Integrated System Plan, which is another sort of big thing that's going on the outside of this. But let's make sure we have this targeted, and it's just not smearing a bunch of public subsidies across an industry just to keep it afloat or just to keep its investment case going. We actually need to be thinking more about what consumers need, both grid connected and non-grid connected, and how you keep those businesses going, not only going, but growing. So that should be the focus of energy policy. How does this impact the consumer? How do we make it easier for consumers, not so much focused on the supply side, who's had it pretty good for quite some time as far as the gravy train's concerned, as far as we're concerned.
So from my perspective, touching on policy principles, I think I agree 100%. We believe that it needs to be technology agnostic. At the end of the day, the key is that the policy gets broad-based support, long-term consistency to allow people to make investment decisions to actually change the supply-demand dynamic. We think that renewables are coming down the curve and will change that balance. We think that batteries are improving at a rate that will allow some of the issues that they can support in intermittency. We believe that gas is an important transition fuel to help with that issue. It goes back to, is it affordable, is it reliable, and is it reducing emissions? And do the principles within that make sure that all of the competing technologies reflect the full cost of the dispatchable availability of the power to make it reliable? Is it done in an orderly manner that allows investment for costs to reduce? And so I think if those policy principles start to come into play, I think the last thing then is just ensuring that that investment comes in a way that fosters competitive tension in the retailer market as well.
Chris?
It's interesting that the last two speakers have both begged for consistency in policy. And sitting on the sideline, watching the blood sport of energy policy in Australia for the last 10 years, the one thing you don't have is consistency, because politicians they react to their electorate, who are domestic consumers. Their power bills have gone up, and all the politicians are saying, I can get you an extra $5 a year off, aren't I wonderful? So everyone votes for them. So the one thing you're not going to get is consistency of energy politician as soon as you put politics into the mix. It just, and all you've got to do is just look at the way things are washed over us in the last 10 years. And it just goes round and round. And the people who get left out of this whole thing are the large industrial consumers. You know, and they say to an aluminium smelter, oh, it's okay, we're just going to turn you off for a couple of days. And this is just defying it, but it isn't defying anything, I suppose. It's that politics are driven by voters. They're not driven by industry. And how industry gets a bigger voice in this policy set is impossible, because industry doesn't vote. However much they think they're important, it's voters who vote. Politicians listen to voters.
I think just on that, and that's very true. And one of the things that we do at the EUAA is talk to our members to say, stop talking about yourselves and start talking about the impact on consumers. So whether you're a food producer or a glass producer or whatever it may be, what is the impact of this? How is that felt in the supermarket? That's where we need to get to, so that mums and dads, the voters, you're right, can actually understand the impact of poor policy. And it's really difficult to get that message through. But also say that the people who work for our businesses, they also vote, so we need to do a better job in explaining what this actually means for them as well.
Just a couple of comments on that, Ash. I guess at a federal level, the neg is a neg. We've been very vocal in our position on it that we're remaining open-minded about it. A lot of our members obviously are not overly keen on it, but we're just making sure that from a federal perspective, we're having a conversation with both sides of politics in regards to what that 7 pages might actually evolve into. At a state level, I'll come on to that in a second, but you know, we have no choice that it has been a political football around for the last 10 years, and now it's intertwined with the environmental piece as well. So yeah, we can talk about having you know, equal competition across technologies, but you know, the situation we're in is it is tied in now with our climate policy, and depending on what happens from you know, a federal election in the next 12 to 18 months, the opposition party has a completely different view on where they're going to bring it. So you can talk to Mark Butler at the minute, and he's smiling, saying we will either have a structure of a neg, whatever that might look like, or they'll have a blank canvas, and they've already talked about pretty extensive renewable energy targets. So, or clean energy targets, depending on what way you want to call it. So revert that back to what has come out of the Finkel, 49 out of 50, and we're starting to see some of them come through from AEMO and AMEC now making that change. So yeah, look, we're all very much from a competition perspective, but from a renewable perspective, if we talk about what voters are doing, we just look at the uptake on rooftop solar. And that is the clear indication that, yeah, it's an energy choice, but it's also an environmental choice. So again, the two of them are intertwined. And that's what politicians have to listen to, is them voters. And mums and dads have been quite clear on where they want to go with it. Can we just jump back then from a state level? I think you were kind of sort of saying, Minister Johnson talked about a few developments in the space. I suppose just from an information perspective, our state government has been watching the NEG developments. As you know, WA don't actually have a vote on it, but I think from a state perspective, it's very, very important that we're actually in the conversation, because we can't let the federal situation just make decisions for us, because particularly this sector is going to be in line to be hit very, very hard. So from a NEG perspective, we just are keeping a very strong finger in the pie as to what's happening. We also encourage energy policy to be done at a federal level. We liked what happened in South Australia. It really kind of kicked things on a bit, but it's just that disconnect again that's just not great for everybody. But Western Australia, you'll always hear is slightly different, but we have our different market and our different grid. The new government have been quite proactive in the space, we feel. Western Power and Horizon are working very hard. Synergy is looking to evolve as well. All state-owned entities, obviously. You're probably aware that there was a microgrid inquiry done recently that's ongoing. Again, just an indication as to how government are actually looking to embrace our sector. And then on a policy piece, Ash is really just the constrained grid political football that's happening in Western Australia that is having a big impact across this sector as well. We're pushing hard that has to be sooner than 2022, but that's a whole different conversation. So look, we're working very closely with the state government and the stakeholders, but I think it's going to have a major impact. Despite all the good news stories around lithium, there's still the day-to-day energy prices, reliability and sustainability, the trifecta again, that has to be taken into consideration.
Sorry, Chris, you want something else to add?
Yes, there was a veiled comment just made by Dermot about our sector. I'm not quite sure what the words you used, but one of the previous speakers was saying a level playing field. And with the new government being very, I think you said, active in this space, for active I read putting their finger in the scale. And as soon as you start having a finger in the scale for wind and solar, you imbalance that level playing field again. And it's got to be, wind and solar have got to be able to stand on their own 2 feet. Talking about the domestic solar panels on roofs. But even those, there's a subsidy, there's an intrinsic subsidy in that already. So we have to be very careful how we look at these industries, because one person's level playing field says, well, it's level from my point of view because it's tilted my way, and I love it like that. But it's got to be level for everybody. Would you agree with that?
Like I said, the days of consumer-funded gravy train or consumer-funded special interest groups need to end, mainly because it's not required anymore. I mean, if you look at Bloomberg New Energy Finance analysis and a whole range of other analysis, you're seeing that renewable energy is now the cheapest in the market. And indeed, a number of our members have actually signed up long-term power purchase agreements with renewable energy players. So it's not a matter of whether that's cost effective or not, because it is. It's really how do you firm it, and how do you firm it in the most efficient way. Then if you're going to go large scale, how do you actually go large scale in a more planned, controlled way rather than the chaos we've had for the last 10 years? Because chaos doesn't work if you want low energy prices.
No, you're right. I mean, even from an electorate perspective, we've seen, I guess, through the engagement I've had with the multiple parties looking to connect new generation at the moment, in particular in South Australia, it's just been a world of not chaos, just acceleration of proponents who've got a project to connect. And a lot of that's to do with a little bit of uncertainty of policy, high prices. Our load users and that are asking those sorts of questions. And I just see that as a key thing going forward. But we've got to about 10 minutes or so to go. So I thought I'd open the floor up to some questions. I'm sure we've got a lot of insights to provide. So if there are any questions from the floor, I'd really welcome some to the panel. Good start.
Policy is not the most exciting thing.
No.
Good morning, gentlemen. My name's Emily Alford. I'm just leaving South Reach and joining Oakley Greenwood, so for those who know me, that's where I'm going. I was really interested, Andrew, in your comment about the need for that retailers are taking a clip on either when on the demand side, but also obviously there's also the issue that when you're wanting to firm up renewables, typically at the moment, particularly on the East Coast, you have to go to a retailer to get that. Do you see, or how soon do you see other options becoming available? In my head, I'm thinking blockchain, banks taking a different position, something else. What are you seeing?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. It's been a fairly substantial discussion within our group with the reliability guarantee in particular. And again, sorry to talk about sort of policy, but that could put a liability on large consumers to play a role in reliability. Some think that's a good thing because they've actually got plenty of opportunity inside their business to initiate, to get involved. Others are a bit more nervous about it. I think big data is something that's going to be critical as we go forward. When you look at what they're contemplating with the reliability guarantee, making sure that we get good data into the system so we can get better demand forecasts. Because in the past, demand forecasts, at least in the East Coast, didn't really matter that much. It was more of a guide. Now demand forecasts are going to trigger an obligation, which could have civil penalties attached to it. So we need to get better at that, and consumers need to play a role in that in providing better data into the demand side of that. So big data is going to play a critical importance in that. It will play a critical importance for consumers to understand where they're using energy and when they're using energy and what are the options to actually avoid some of these costs, but also what are the opportunities to actually play into that market, to be a participant and make money out of it. And I think the session that we had before probably wouldn't have occurred a couple of years ago. We wouldn't have had that conversation. And what that indicated to me, and what I've seen around in many places, is that technology and consumers are leading politicians and regulators on this. And if politicians and regulators don't fix it, the consumers will have to start to do it themselves. And we're starting to see a bit of that occurring. Now, we prefer to see a more planned approach to that, but I think there's some critical issues coming forward that consumers, if they understand big data, they can get a clear access to the market, like I just explained with demand response before, and it give consumers more control of their own destiny rather than relying on a counterparty. And I think that would be ultimately better for consumers, for most consumers, for the ones that can transition.
Yeah, I think that's just the only comment I'd add on that is the days of the large consumers getting their retail bill coming in and then just signing it and moving on and worrying about productivity and production are gone. They're all starting to really question it. And, you know, the fact that there is these conversations around peer-to-peer, virtual power stations, you know, behind-the-meter solutions, microgrids, have really pricked the ears up of people to kind of, okay, what is my best option? What is the options we have on this? So, you know, it's that evolving, and it's been consumer driven, which, you know, is the nice piece. We're saying that if we could get government to step out of it in some capacity, wouldn't it be great? You know?
I mean, even from our perspective, new generation, new load, the questions that have been asked over the last 12 or 18 months are so different to they were a few years ago. The maturity of the conversation, that is not necessarily the answers there, but the maturity of the conversation, the things to consider is so much more progressed than it ever was. That's a good thing. You know, people start to understand, I think, come back to risk. It obviously allows people to go, what are my risks? What is it for my business? How do I deal with this? How do I handle it? Am I here short-term, long-term? You know, how do I play in this? So
I think large consumers don't want to have to manage energy that deeply, but they don't want to, but they have to now. I mean, we have on the gas side. I mean, let's face it, LNG at the moment looks like the biggest own goal that we've kicked, you know, from the economy point of view. But people say, I don't want to be attached to international gas price. Well, I'm sorry, you are. So you need to understand that and deal with it.
Yeah, I agree. the really interesting thing is it is such a significant risk issue, and it has changed so dramatically that people are moving and taking on changes, innovations, and there's some changes happening in my sector where people are really challenging very much their business models and challenging very much how they feed their power into their energy needs into their business models, which is actually a good thing. And then in the steel space, we've got a couple of let's just call it disruptors or people with a different attitude, like Sanjeev Gupta and what he's doing now with the whole Liberty One Steel Group, investing in renewables to run the steelworks, investing in batteries. The battery that was shown on the screen today, he's put in place plans to build a bigger one than that again. Now, he knows at the end of the day, well, he has a belief at the end of the day that Australia has the power, has the ability to be a powerhouse in carbon-based manufacturing or carbon-free manufacturing, and he's taking a chance to go down that road because he's not going to wait for the politicians to make their decisions.
I mean, let's not give the impression, though, that it's some very sort of happy garden party of free capital and innovation. Some people will go broke because they can't.
100% agree.
Okay,
People will
so
take risks.
we need to be very strategic about this. Assist those who are able to transition, make that as efficient as possible. Identify those industries that are going to struggle, and work with them on transformational policy. Because there are some who they can't get the internal capital. They've got a 110-year-old plant that they can't retrofit. A whole range of things that come into this. And if they can get cheap, for example, pulp and paper. If it's cheaper for them to do it in New Zealand, they'll just move capacity to New Zealand. And we're seeing that already.
Yeah, we're seeing that right across our sector, where people are making decisions now on where they put their capital, and it's moving.
Just one quick comment on that, Ash. What we're finding that if these conversations were happening 12, 18 months ago, you'd have a room full of sceptical miners, and you'd have a room full of people from my industry going, have I got a deal for you? Have I got a product for you? Whereas within the last 12 or 18 months, I think it's been that growth in conversation from an understanding perspective. And don't forget, something we haven't talked too much about is a lot of our sector now is coming with finance, be it internal, in-country finance or external finance. So it can take that off balance sheet or take that risk off large users when people are coming with the finance package to back up a technology solution.
Very much, and we obviously from an electorate perspective look at offering those sorts of, wrapping up a whole service opportunity and turning something from a CapEx to an OpEx and helping where we can in that space. I think the transformation piece is really important because as we see it from a grid perspective, it's great to have people that are moving ahead and making things happen, but it does cascade back to could impact other users and so forth, things like from a grid perspective, a technical perspective. So you're right, we need to plan this way through or we could end up with a potentially bigger mess to deal with later on. So we need to think about that. Are there any other questions?
We have time for one more question for the panel. Any questions? Oh.
Hi, my name is Prakash Seth. I'm from Blue Diamond Group of Companies. And I have some comments. I've heard a lot about what we have spoken. But let's first take an example from India. 4 years back, India had a 30% power shortage. And within 4 years, by renewables, as well as with coal-fired power plants, they are exporting power now to Sri Lanka. They've been surplus. We have been talking about renewables in past 7 to 10 years. But there's no action because you have a substandard grid in Western Australia where there is no investment going into more. The generators have a high capital cost, but they don't get connectivity. So the question comes, yes, that this is all fine to talk about renewables, but what happens when you have, like in China, I have a car in Malaysia which I charge at home. When the consumers start charging their cars at home, you'll have problem with your grid because there's no investment in the grid today. So why don't you privatize, tell the government to privatize the grid connections where we can do investments in billion, and in the time you get a grid connection, I could build a transmission line whole Australia. Forget only WA. So the question to the panel is that it's good to talk about, but come up with some concrete action. Because today, I had a project of $2 billion investment creating 23,000 jobs. Where do I take that project? Malaysia. Why would I come to Australia when you talk about no sovereign risk? The minister said in the morning, but it's not about sovereign risk. It's about the people who implement the laws which they pass. The bureaucracies to get any permission takes years. So what I would like to hear from the panel, what should be done to change this? Even third world countries today are far off better off than Australia.
You are absolutely correct. A couple of issues. We've had substantial increases in grid costs over the last 5 to 10 years. So we know we need to build new grid to the new resource zones that are out there, whether they be wind or solar or whatever they may be, or pumped hydro. We know we need to do that because they're the new resource zones. We need to do that in a planned way because we haven't done that in a planned way in the last 10 years, and that's increased costs quite dramatically. So there is a thing called the Integrated System Plan that I mentioned before, which is striving to create a planned outcome that gives us the most efficient grid investment from predominantly private investors, because they're the ones who own predominantly the transmission system other than Queensland, to try and give them the guidance on where they should be building, when and to what extent, because we haven't had that in the past. It's been very ad hoc. So I agree 100% with you. It can be done, but it requires a higher level of system planning than we've had in the last 10 years. So what can we do? We need that higher level of system planning in place and agreed so that we are connecting the best assets to the most efficient grid that can be used in a multiple of ways so we get the best bang for our buck. Because quite frankly, consumers will not stomach a continuation of ad hoc grid connection and increasing revenue basis, sorry mate, of grid operators that we've suffered in the last 10 years. So I agree 100% with you. We need that plan in place and that guidance in place.
Yeah, I'll literally follow up with Andrew about agreeing on most of that. I guess what we're kind of seeing on a few different levels. ISP is the first stuff. Probably the main findings we're finding from Finkel that's coming out to address the actual grid itself. Literally, you know, should we be spending a huge amount on transmission projects, or is distributed generation, microgrids, fringe of grid disconnect the way it's going to go? So that's the varying of scales as to what can happen. So the ISP is the first step towards that, and I'm sure Ashton would probably have a couple of comments from a grid owner perspective. In Western Australia, we're still publicly owned grids. So again, be that good thing or bad thing, but we are seeing a lot of innovation happen in that space. And I'm sure Western Power and Horizon are probably here. But I think it's going to be a combination of everything in regards to what happens with the actual transmission and network and distribution networks, because the big unknown that people are still talking about that you mentioned is the EV world and what happens when that sort of starts leveraging out that duck curve in the middle of the afternoon as to what actually happens. So it's going to be a combination. There's not going to be one size fits all, but what we are seeing is the AEMO have been mandated to start making changes. And so Audrey Zimmerman has actually come in and started to actually identify these issues and starts putting some actual plans in place. So to answer your question, what's been done, I think we have to look towards the AEMO and kind of seeing what kind of major steps forward they are currently taking.
I don't know if you had anything, Tony, to add.
I don't think, I agree with both comments. I don't think I can add a lot to it other than what these gentlemen have just said. We spent a lot of time with a lot of conversation around policy, which is quite boring. But the reality is, until we get some policy certainty, we won't get investment, we won't get these strategic decisions made. And it's absolutely fundamental that we get through this next round of discussions and get some policy certainty to allow people to make investment decisions.
Yeah, right. I'm happy to finish on that note as well. From I guess a grid operator and developer for South Australia's perspective, you know, we see the ISP as a key element to that. It's been very difficult as a business to look at build it and they will come as a regulated entity to make sure there's the support underneath to support those projects. We're doing some stuff at the moment privately with Oz Minerals, who we'll talk a little bit tomorrow about some major infrastructure for them, which will enable elements in the state, enable future opportunities to come along. We're looking at potential interconnection as well, and that's been the real challenge with that sort of limiting factor to try and do the build it and they will come has been a big risk bucket to take. And with changing technology, renewables coming on so quickly in batteries, there's all those opportunities there now in front. So I think this ISP plan actually helps with that. I mean, if you'd asked me 2 years ago, would have I seen a pump storage project in South Australia, the driest state and the driest continent in the world with no hills anywhere, and we've got a good 6 or so very active pump storage projects. And whether they go somewhere, whether they connect and how, that'll go through its own journey. But it certainly is changing, and part of that planning and policy has got to help pave the way. On that note, I'll finish off, Adrienne, but I'd like to personally thank everyone for your inputs today. It's been a great discussion.
Thanks very much, Ashley.